On the surface, FP&A might sound pretty straightforward, but over time you eventually realize there's so many different career paths that you can take. If you're not careful, then you're going to end up pigeonholing yourself in the wrong path, and so this video is going to break down the most common paths and which one I personally think is the best. If you're new here, I'm Shawn Hakimi, and I've worked in FP&A in both Fortune 500s and startups in a variety of different roles, and I'd love to help you get the best possible job you can get within FP&A. And with that in mind, let's jump in. Now, if you still don't feel familiar enough with what FP&A is, then I highly recommend watching this video right here as a precursor to this one. But if you're all set, then let's jump in for career path number 1. So the first career path that I want to talk about is known as sales FP&A. Now, you might also hear this referred to as GTM FP&A or go-to-market FP&A. And on the other hand, you might also hear revenue FP&A. In this FP&A role, as the name suggests, you're really primarily focused on partnering with sales and marketing teams in determining what's driving revenue. And with that, since you're really focused on the main driver of the business and the top line of the income statement, a lot of the time you're spent on trying to figure out how much does it cost to acquire a customer, or what is the overall value of a customer over its lifetime within your business. And one of the difficult things within a sales FP&A role is really partnering with marketing teams, trying to figure out how much a brand campaign is going to cost, when you see an advertisement on TV as an example, and then how many customers we expect to bring in to the business and how much revenue that's actually going to generate. Now, moving on, career path number 2 is called R&D FP&A. This is also known as product FP&A, and as the name suggests there, you're typically working a lot of times with the individuals responsible for making the product of that business. So if you wanted to work in a tech company and be heavily involved with other software engineers and figuring out what kind of tools they use, or if you want to figure out how much return on investment you're going to get from a new product release within a tech business, then this is the right role for you. Similarly, in a manufacturing business, this would be the finance role working hand in hand with the mechanical engineers who are responsible for making a physical product. All right, so number 3 is G&A FP&A. This stands for General and Administrative FP&A, and although it sounds like a simple name, this is really covering all of the different departments in the company outside of sales and marketing and product. And so in this role, you're typically partnering with the legal team, the finance and accounting team, the people and recruiting team, the information technology team potentially, and a bunch of others that aren't captured within the first 2 categories. This role is really for someone who wants to get a variety of different experiences and exposure to multiple business partners from different backgrounds that you otherwise would not get within the first 2 career paths. As I mentioned, since this role involves working with so many different teams, you're not typically structured around focusing on just one area. And so one day you might be focused on analyzing legal expenses, and then the other day you might be figuring out what the recruiting team needs and which area of the country they want to hire in the most. And so it can really add a lot of variety to your FP&A experience. Now, moving on to number 4 with one of the most common that you might see, this is corporate FP&A. Now, within the first 3 career paths that I mentioned, I talked a lot about partnering with other departments within the company. So if you're within sales FP&A, you're working a lot of times with the sales teams. If you're within G&A, you might work with legal people, as we mentioned. And so within corporate FP&A, your main responsibility actually is partnering with the FP&A team and finance team itself. And so if you think of a flowchart, corporate FP&A is kind of at the top of everything, and every other FP&A team reports into that corporate FP&A group. The reason for this is that the corporate FP&A team is really responsible for summarizing and owning the reporting for the entire company as a whole. What this means is that they're not super in the weeds like the first 3 on everything going on within a specific area, but more so are at a bird's eye view, looking down at every other finance partner, trying to summarize what's going on in the business and taking that information so that they could show that to the executive team, or that they could prepare a memo for the board of directors of how the company is performing overall. In addition to that, whenever you see a quarterly earnings report for a public company, a lot of times the corporate FP&A team is the one responsible for consolidating that data and putting that together for shareholders to see for themselves. Now, last but not least, number 5 is strategic finance. Now, strategic finance is kind of odd because you can actually be within any of the first 3 paths that I mentioned and still be in a strategic finance role. And so let me explain why that is. So what strategic finance is essentially focusing on the A within FP&A. You're heavily focused on analysis and taking on strategic projects that help executives make decisions. And where this differs from the other paths is that whereas in other FP&A roles, you may be spending 30% of your time doing these strategic kinds of projects, within a strategic finance titled role, you're really spending 60 to 70% or more of your time on this kind of work alone. Now, these roles are some of the hardest to get within the field of FP&A, and that is primarily because they are the ones that get some of the most exposure to speaking with and outlining information to the executive leadership team of companies. Strategic projects might sound confusing, but what it essentially means is that let's say you're in a subscription business and they have multiple tiers. They might be trying to figure out what to price each of those subscription tiers at. And so within this role, you might be spending days, if not weeks or months, trying to figure out the optimal price to set each tier at by looking at the competition, meeting with other businesses even, and looking at a variety of different data to come up with a report and a conclusion on what decision the company should make. Another example is you might be trying to figure out if you should have customer support specialists housed within your company, so you hire them as actual employees, or to outsource them to another international companies to save costs, and then trying to figure out the analysis if that cost saving is worth it. So for example, if you outsource to another country, you might get some expense savings, but then maybe the quality of your customer service drops down and inherently you lose customers from your business. And then at the end of the day, you'd lower your revenue. All right, so now that you know all of the career paths within FP&A, which one is the best to start your career in? In all honesty, whichever one of those paths sounded the most interesting to you is the one that you should go for. At the end of the day, a good FP&A career involves slowly transitioning to get an understanding of all of those different paths. So at 10 years into the career, you should have had some experience to the sales side, the G&A side, and also the R&D side, and especially corporate finance. But with that in mind, if I were to pick one, it would definitely be corporate FP&A. As I mentioned, FP&A is kind of the bird's eye view of the business and allows you to get a really good summary of how a company operates from start to finish and how its income statement flows from top to bottom. And so without a doubt, if I were starting within the field, this would be the one area that I would want to go into the most. Now, if I were in FP&A for a while now, which one would I try to specialize in and view as the overall best? That would be sales FP&A. Look, sales is what drives the business and revenue is what keeps that machine going. And so if you're within the sales FP&A team, you're really going to get the most consistent exposure to leadership out of any of these paths. Not only that, but sales being the most highly prioritized and valued function within a company a lot of times means that in most cases, I've actually seen that the sales FP&A team members can make the best argument for the highest pay. And so if salary is one of the most important factors to you, then I would highly suggest that you pursue a sales FP&A path. One important point to note that you need to know is that FP&A can vary so much between different companies. And so you might not see the paths that I just outlined here within every business. Actually, within really large companies, you might just see something called corporate FP&A, as we mentioned, or business unit FP&A. So a good example to understand this is if you worked in a company like Meta. So at Meta, as we mentioned, the company's so big, they obviously need a corporate FP&A team to take information from around the business and consolidate it for investor earnings report and for leadership to understand how the business is performing. So how the business unit FP&A teams work instead is that you may just have a small FP&A team just focused on a subsection of Meta. So they would be focused on, let's say, the metaverse, or they might be focused on just Facebook. And then within each of those business unit teams, they might have some members focused on sales of metaverse or the G&A functions within Facebook, but in reality, they're just referred to as business unit FP&A teams. What this essentially means is that the business unit might just operate as its own tiny company, and you'll become very familiar with that subsection of the company. And then if you want to get an overall view of how the entire business is doing, then you definitely want to be in that corporate FP&A role. And now you should be super familiar with all of the career paths in FP&A. And with that, I highly recommend you watch one of these videos right here that will outline how much you should be making within a career path in FP&A and some of my favorite tips on what to do within your job search to get your first FP&A position. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and until next time, talk soon.